Okay, let's go ahead and get started. This part of the chapter, we really focus on some changes that happened, some political changes that happened in Europe that were driven by something called the Enlightenment. Okay? And the Enlightenment was people using reason and logical thought to think things through. For the longest time in Europe, people had done exactly what the king had said. They had done exactly what the nobles told them to do. They did exactly what the church told them to do without questioning any of it. And one of the side effects of the Renaissance, as people of Europe rediscovered the teachings and the ideas of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, one of the things they rediscovered was philosophy, the idea of just thinking about things and thinking about things using logic to make sure that things actually made sense. And this brings us to this time called the Enlightenment in Europe, where people start to question society. They're questioning politics. They're questioning the church, as we see with people like Martin Luther in the Reformation. They're not afraid to challenge and question why things are being done the way they're being done. Some of the new ideas that people started having about government. Remember, government back then were monarchies. It was kings and queens. That was the government of the time in Europe. And one of the basic ideas of being a king was you were all powerful. What you said went. People, remember, we talked about people believing that kings had a divine right to be king, that God wanted them to be king. And so again, people start to question this. And one of the people that did a lot of the questioning and had a lot of thoughts about this was a gentleman named John Locke. And John Locke came up with a philosophy, an idea, that there was a social contract between a ruler and his people. So as this diagram shows, on one side you have the government, okay, and then, again, at this time we're talking about kings. On this side we have the common everyday people, and John Locke said that a contract existed between the people and their government, or their king in this case. And the way the contract should work is that the king's job was to protect the rights of his people. And in return, if the king was protecting their rights, the people would allow the king to have power, allow him to stay in power. But conversely, and this is the part that was sort of a new idea, if the king was misusing his power, John Locke said the people had the right to replace or overthrow the king. And that was a pretty dangerous thing to say. Because as you know, back in these times, if you spoke out against the king, you could find yourself quickly in jail or even executed. So John Locke discussed things like the idea that people were born with certain natural rights, like life and liberty. And that both the government and the people were responsible for keeping the peace, and the leader has to protect the natural rights that John Locke said people were born with. Now, of course, this wasn't something that every king thought was a great idea. In 1628 in England, a conflict arises between Parliament, and Parliament was made up of the nobles who were supposed to be sharing power with the king, and King Charles I. If you remember, there was a Magna Carta. We talked about the Magna Carta before, and in 1215, the Magna Carta was written by a group of nobles, and the whole goal was to limit the power of the king. Limit power. Sorry, my handwriting looks kind of funky, but I'm using a drawing pad, and I'm not very used to it, so I'll do the best I can, but hopefully you can read it well enough. And for about 400 years or so, as you can see, we're talking 1628. The Magna Carta was in 1215. So during that 400-year time span, most kings pretty much ignored the Magna Carta, ignored this agreement between the nobles and the king, that the nobles should be sharing power with the king, that the king shouldn't be able to raise taxes whenever he saw fit or take people's property from them. So a civil war arises, and remember, a civil war is a war between people within one country. It's not people fighting another country, it's people fighting within their own country. But a civil war arises, and eventually the Parliament and the people overthrow the king, and Charles I is beheaded. Excuse me. The English Bill of Rights is written following this, and again, it's just something that's set up to reaffirm the Magna Carta. to reaffirm those basic ideas of the Magna Carta of a limit of power to the king, fair rules for everyone, fair taxes among the classes of people. And we see finally an end to this ridiculous notion that somehow God is choosing the kings. People finally, through logical reasoning, say, you know what, that doesn't make any sense at all to us. Another revolution breaks out that affects England because it happens in America, which of course was a colony of England. And the basic problem that the people in the colonies had with the King of England was the fact that they weren't allowed to have anyone represent them in Parliament in England. Here they were all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from England, and the King of England was still telling the people in the colonies how to live their lives and what to do, and they were taxing them, but they got no representation in Parliament back in England. And that was sort of the battle cry of the American Revolution: no taxation without representation. So the people decided, or some of the leaders decided, that it was time to break off and form their own country. They didn't want a king anymore. This began first with protests, and eventually it turned to violence. In 1775, the Declaration of Independence was written by a group of leaders of the colonies, and basically it was a letter to the King George of England saying that we intend to become our own country, and challenging the king, saying that if you don't want that to happen, you'll have to come and stop us. And of course, I think, as most of you know, the new nation and England went to war. The war lasted a couple of years, and in 1783, a new nation that we currently live in, the United States of America, was formed. Problems in France. And the crux of most of the problems in France was the way that society was broken down. France was made up of the 3 estates, and the first estate was the clergy, the people of the church, and they made up about 0.5% of the population of France. The second estate were the nobles, the really rich people. They made up about 1.5% of the population of France. The third estate, and if you're a strong math student, you should be able to figure out that those two combined is 2%, which leaves us with 98%, almost all of the population of France, belonged to the third estate. And these were the average everyday people. Many of them were poor and starving, but their king and queen were living richly, extravagantly. And on top of that, they paid the highest taxes in France, which doesn't seem fair at all. The poorest people are paying the most in taxes. King Louis XIV absolutely refused to sign anything limiting his powers like had been done in England. So, the third estate is getting more and more upset with the leadership of France. They finally realize that at 98%, there's many more of them than there are of these guys. And we get angry mobs forming in the streets of Paris, the capital city, and on July 14th, of 1789, the French mob storms the Bastille, which was a prison, and they did release some criminals. I believe there's only something like 7 people in prison, 7 political prisoners released at the time. But what they really wanted were weapons, because it's hard to fight a war or a revolution without weapons. And the Bastille happened to be an armory where the French army, kept their guns and swords and things. So at this point, the revolution is on. And the people start to burn the houses of the nobles and the monasteries of the clergy, the first and second estates, and this leads to a time known by the first and second estates as the Great Fear. All of a sudden, the people that had been living in luxury and had been on top of the heap of the social status of France were running for their lives from the revolutionaries that were taking over the country. 1789, the revolutionaries have taken over the country. They write and sign the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and among things, it demanded more fair taxes. And France became a republic, and we've talked about this word republic quite a few times this year. And if you remember, it means that you get to vote for your leaders. The United States is a form of a republic because we get to vote for our leaders. One of the problems with having a revolution, though, is the new government isn't always better or even as good as the old government. And that's what happened at the end of the French Revolution. It turned out to be an epic failure. The government was very bad. They were fighting over power. They had no clear plan of who was going to take power. And they distrusted absolutely everyone. And so we move into a new time called the Reign of Terror. And in the Reign of Terror, the government, this new government, not the king anymore, but the new revolutionary government, executed anyone who disagreed with them. And one of their favorite ways of doing that was the guillotine. And, the people pretty much demand a new leader, someone to bring some stability and control. And Napoleon Bonaparte is put into power in France because they needed a strong leader, and he really was a strong leader. But by 1799, Napoleon becomes one of the 3 consuls or leaders of France, but pretty quickly he names himself the first consul, and eventually he declares himself emperor. And again, if that sounds familiar, it sounds a lot like Julius Caesar. Let me see if I can spell Caesar right. I always have trouble with that. I have to look in the phone book for Little Caesar's Pizza and see if I spelled that right. Just like Rome had a rise and a fall, so did Napoleon. He was an amazing military leader. He restored order to France. He came up with the Napoleonic Code, which gave equality before the law to the people. He also established schools. Let's see if I can spell today. Fair taxes. Okay. He also expanded the empire, the French Empire. Expanded empire. So his actions over the first couple of years really made France probably the strongest power in Europe at the time. But, as always, if there's a rise, unfortunately, there ends up being a fall. Napoleon also harshly punished anyone who went against him, so even though he was a well-liked leader, he also knew how to keep his power. In 1812, as he was, again, sending his invading armies all through Europe, he made the mistake of trying to invade Russia, and his armies were defeated by the weather, and in particular, winter. If you think about where Russia is on a map geographically, most of Russia is pretty far north, so of course their winters, as we know from our studies of climate, are going to be very, very harsh. And Napoleon's armies, his French army, were nowhere near prepared for how cold the winter was. They didn't have the proper gear, the proper equipment, the proper clothing. And eventually soldiers just refused to fight anymore. Eventually, Napoleon was exiled, which means being thrown out of his own country, and he died in 1821. Okay, picking up Napoleon's mess. The Congress of Vienna was convened. Leaders of Europe decided in 1814 to meet in Vienna, which is a city right here that was in the Austrian Empire and is still in the country of Austria today. And again, the map, as always, the map's a little bit different back in these times. But they met in Vienna at the Congress of Vienna, and the leaders of Europe wanted to avoid the same mistake, avoid anyone from becoming as powerful as Napoleon had during his reign. So they decided to redraw the lines of Europe so that no one person would become too powerful again like Napoleon had. And again, if you look at this map, if we looked at a number of maps of Europe over the time periods that we've been studying, the map is constantly changing. You see down here an area called the Ottoman Empire, which of course, as you know, doesn't exist today. You have the Austrian Empire here, the German Federation, something called Prussia, which sounds a whole lot like Russia, but Russia's over here. Here's the Kingdom of Poland. Again, these are terms that aren't even used anymore today. Some things are the same, like Great Britain and France and Spain and Portugal, but this part of Europe in particular changes quite a bit. So these lines get redrawn so you don't have any empire. Hopefully that's too strong, although as we're going to find out in our next chapter, that really doesn't help.